Hi everybody, thank you for tuning back in to Haunted Histories. I do apologise for the technical errors we had last night with the live that I was trying to do. What I've decided to do instead is to pre-record it for you so that even if the systems go down again, you've still got it to watch if you're so inclined. Now, as many of you know, the presentation I was doing last night was on workhouses, and the whole Victorian workhouse movement is a particular favourite of mine. I enjoy reading about it, I enjoy talking about it, I enjoy teaching people things about it that they may not otherwise have realised. So I thought it would be a good one to talk about and to go through some of the potential misconceptions that you may have. Now, I wanted to make these sessions quite short, sharp and sweet for you so that you didn't get too bored. I'm looking at about 20 to 30 minutes, but if you do have any questions, obviously drop me a query on the Haunted Histories page that you're hopefully looking at this from, or if not, just message me with any queries you've got on the workhouses and I will hopefully be able to answer them for you. Now, what are we going to be looking at? Well, there's two elements that I'm hoping to look at on today's presentation, and those are what exactly were the poor laws and why do they get talked about so much, and also what life was like behind the wall. Now, this is going to be pretty limited because you could talk for a good hour or so alone on the one of the main acts that we're actually going to look at. I don't actually want to do that. I wanted to talk about some of what I think are the salient points of it. But again, if you want to look into it further, the information is all there readily accessible online. So even in the current lockdown, you don't have to leave your house if it's something that's of interest. There's a lot of other things on the workhouse that we could do a presentation on in the future. The medicine side of it, how so many of the workhouses ended up becoming old people's homes in the 1940s and 50s when the workhouse movement was finally finished. What caused the workhouse movement to finish, for example. How the poor laws evolved over the 100 years or so, what I would class as the Victorian workhouse. But I'm not going to look at those today because, like we say, there is an awful lot of information and I want to keep it short, sharp and sweet, and hopefully you'll enjoy what we're talking about. So let's have a look at some of the actual poor laws to begin with. Now, the first one really that we tend to look at as poor law historians is the 1597 Poor Relief Act, and this was one that kind of it's the initial thing that looked at looking after the poor and how to deal with the poor of the community, and what this actually required. And this is all in a nutshell. A lot of these are nutshell things. You're not going to get the full Monty on this because you know, like I say, I read these acts through, so you don't have to if you don't want to. But in a nutshell, they appointed overseers, and these overseers were responsible for collecting the poor rate contributions from each parish and then redistributing them to the poor. As I said, I stress each parish, not sort of a city or a town. It was down to the parish to look after their own poor, and this is quite an important point to remember. These are commonly known as the Old Poor Laws because the one that followed the 1597 Poor Relief Act was the 1601 Poor Law, Elizabethan Poor Law, or the Old Poor Law. And what that actually introduced was that there was different types of poor people. Everyone who was poor wasn't poor out of choice, or because they were work shy or feckless or had made stupid decisions in their lives, as it was perceived to be. It could have been because they were elderly and therefore unable to work due to their age and infirmity or mental health issues, all those kind of things, and those were classed as what they called the impotent poor. Then those people were actually looked after in what we would now call almshouses or poorhouses, not the workhouse that we are going to be talking about shortly, but these were places, charitable places, where they would be looked after. But the stress was those had to be people who were unable to work, not people who chose not to work. The able-bodied, i.e. those who could be working if they so chose to, were going to be going to places called houses of industry. And in fact, a lot of the workhouses, as they become subsequently in 1834, some of them were originally houses of industry where the able-bodied poor who were able to work were sent to do work and able to get relief. You then had the idle poor and vagrants. Now, this was against the law to be an idle poor or a vagrant or a beggar. So these people were sent to, in effect, a form of prison, but it would have been the houses of correction as opposed to your big scary jails. Now, I was asked recently, what's the difference between a house of correction and a jail? Well, it's really to do with the crimes and the sentencing. Most people wouldn't be in a house of correction for more than, say, about two years. So the crimes were meant to be quite not too bad. So it might have been a lot of women would have been sent there for things like prostitution. You would have had people sent there for being beggars or vagrants or, as we've put, the idle poor. And children, well, children would have been sent out as apprentices, because in those days there was no age as when a child could really start working. So you could have a 6 or 7 year old child as your apprentice, and then hopefully that would break the poor trend that maybe their parents had fallen into where they didn't have any work. In 1834, there were things in between 1601 and 1834, it has to be said, but that was the crux of how the poor were treated until the Poor Law Amendment Act in 1834. Now, one of the reasons that this came about, if you remember, I said the poor, looking after the poor, was dependent upon the parishes. Well, look at it now. Certain areas have more people who need help with income and all those kind of things than other areas in the UK. And this was exactly the same in the 19th century. So you had certain parishes that were literally bankrupt from looking after their paupers and everything else. And so what was looked at was, well, is there a way that we could amalgamate these into unions? And that's where the Poor Law Union came about, hence the Union Workhouse. But in Southwell, in Nottinghamshire, and this place is still there, and you can go and visit it. It's a National Trust property, and I can hasten to say, if you're ever in the area, Nottinghamshire, go and visit Southwell Workhouse. It's fascinating. They actually did it 10-15 years before everyone else and amalgamated all the parishes and said, hey, let's pool our resources and see what we can do and see if we can save money, which they did. One of the things in the Poor Law Amendment Act, which people think I'm joking when I talk about it, is something known as the bastardy clause. Now, no, I'm not swearing, but back in those days, back in the 19th century, and just before Queen Victoria came to power, having a baby out of wedlock was seen to be pretty much the worst sin that you could commit. It was almost as bad as murder as far as they were concerned. So they wanted to encourage, or discourage, should we say, women, and it was always the woman's fault, let's be honest. Yes, that's sarcasm. They wanted to discourage the woman from actually sleeping with somebody who wasn't her husband. So therefore they put in something called the bastardy clause. Before that, if a woman got pregnant out of wedlock, she was able to take it to the petty sessions courts and ask for money, ask for maintenance from the father, even if they weren't married. But what the bastardy clause brought in was, well, you had to prove unequivocally that he is the father. And let's be honest, 19th century, early 19th century, there is no Jeremy Kyle, there ain't no DNA testing. How are you going to prove it? So a lot of these women became what they'd known as debased or fallen women. And for a lot of them, the workhouse or the poorhouse would have been their only option. To actually make them even more pariahs, I suppose, they were expected to dress slightly differently as well. Some of them would be expected to wear a yellow jacket to show that they'd had a child out of wedlock. Some of them had a yellow stripe across their dress, their workhouse dress. And although this was officially abolished in 1844, there were guardians of workhouses who were still so vehemently opposed to women actually getting pregnant out of wedlock that they still made them look different and act or be ostracised, if you like, from the rest of the community. And that's just one of the things that the Act brought in that was different to what it had been before. All this stuff is listed in the 1834 Act. None of this is interpreted by myself or other historians. It's all listed there if you want to see it. Now, we mentioned before that with the Elizabethan poor laws, they did actually classify people as being able-bodied poor, impotent poor, etc., etc. And I'm not actually talking about the vagrancy side or the casuals, as they were called, the ones who would originally have gone to the House of Correction. That's a completely separate presentation in its own right. But they still had classifications and individual areas in the new Union Workhouse for different types of people. So you had those who were old and infirm. Now, old didn't necessarily mean infirm. You could have someone who was still able to work in their 80s, but if they weren't, or they were infirm, somebody say of 35 who may have, I don't know, severe rheumatoid arthritis and couldn't actually work, they would be allowed to not work. They would be allowed to be there almost as a care home, for want of a better term. Then you have the able-bodied adults, men and women, again completely separated. Husband and wives would have been separated upon going in. And then you had the children between the ages of 7 and 12, again, boys and girls, separated. And then you had children under the age of 7. The story I like to tell about this is where I like to teach my children facts to do with history. As you can probably imagine, I'm a historian. What else would I do? And we pass an old workhouse on the way to my parents' house in East Anglia. And for the last 3 or 4 years, every time we've gone past it, I've taught my older child, who's now nearly 11, a fact about the workhouse. One of the first ones I taught him when he was about 7.5 was that, did he know that if we'd actually gone into the workhouse, he would have been taken away from me. His little brother, who was then about 4, would have been allowed to stay with me, albeit I wouldn't have been able to care for him full time. It would have been down to other women and other people there to help care for all the young children who were under the age of 7. But they tended to be allowed to stay with their mothers in the able-bodied women's dormitory. But when the women were working, somebody else would look after them. But they were, he was quite shocked that at 7.5 he wouldn't be able to see me again. Now, children, the reason children weren't treated as harshly perhaps as adults is it was seen it wasn't really their fault that their parents were poor. We're going to talk about the Victorian attitude towards the poor shortly, but children were seen as deserving poor. They deserved compassion, they deserved some help because it wasn't their choice. The other thing to bear in mind is somebody asked me once, well, I could dump my kids and my wife in the poorhouse and then bugger off, scarper off and live the life of Riley. No. If you turned up with children and a spouse or a husband in the workhouse, you couldn't leave them there and leave on your own. You left with who you came with, obviously, if they'd passed away. But towards the sort of latter stages of the workhouse movement, towards the later 1800s, the early 1900s, people were, predominantly men, it has to be said, because they were seen as the breadwinners, but they were allowed to leave on day release to go to work, to help them. But they couldn't just leave their kids and family in there and bugger off and do their own thing. Now, unsurprisingly, there was work to be done in the workhouse, and there was also a very, very heavy sense of religion. Religion was very important to the Victorian era. In fact, it tied in, and I'm going to talk about in a sec how it tied in with how they believed, or why they believed some people were poor. But in the top corner there, I don't know where you're looking at it, but there where there's some old women, it looks like they're almost like tumbleweeds they're separating. That would have been what's something called oakum picking, where they would have a spike, which is where they think the terminology, the spike being a word for the term slang, if you like, for the workhouse came in, and they would spend all day separating out those crumpled bits of rope to get the actual fibres, which would then be used. They would then be used to actually line and waterproof ships' hulls and all of those kind of things. But whereas we might think of the workhouse as being a cruel and barren place, it was meant to be like that. It was meant to be the last possible solution. You were never meant to want to go into the workhouse. It was meant to be imposing. It was meant to be foreboding and all those kind of words. You were meant to look at any other opportunity, any other solution to your poverty than going into the workhouse. And I always tell the example, I think it was my great-great-grandmother, and in the 1920s, so the workhouse was still around then. She lived in a tight cottage. Her husband, my great-grandfather, was a steel worker, And he died very suddenly in his 30s, early 30s. They had 3 children under the age of 5, and she was literally given 2 days to get out of the Thai cottage because it was for employees, it wasn't for their families. She went to the workhouse, or went to the poor law and poor union, and said, can I have some money please, can I have some out relief to enable me to buy a sewing machine so that I can take in work and support my family? And they said, nah, your choice is the workhouse or nothing. Whether it's true, but basically I got told that she literally metaphorically stuck 2 fingers up to them and said, I'll find another way. And she did. But that was intentional. They didn't want people to look at it as an easy solution. It was meant to be hard. The work that they did in the workhouse was hard because they couldn't do work that people were trying to earn money for on the outside, because if they undercut people doing the work on the outside, that would mean those people would have to come into the workhouse, and they would have more and more people that the state or the union and the different parishes were actually having to fund. So they had to do work that nobody would want to do. Things like stone crushing, very common in the casual wards. One of the things they used to do in the early days was bone crushing. So they would get old animal bones and all those kind of things, and then they would be crushed for fertiliser. However, anyone who's got an awareness of workhouse history will know that this gave rise to something called the Andover scandal, and bone crushing was quite soon stopped after that particular scandal. But the jobs had to be tedious. They had to be something that nobody on the outside would want to do. Same as the schedule of the workhouse. It had to look unappealing. This was the schedule that again was in the 1834 Act. Again, I've not made this up. This is all listed in there. And it was regimented. They had to get up at a certain time. They would have a certain period of time for breakfast. They would have work. And this was Monday to Saturday every week, come rain or shine. There was 2 schedules, one for summer hours, one for the winter hours. And again, every day, 6 days a week. The only day they had off was on a Sunday, which is when they would be expected to go to church, whether it was a local church or whether it was a chapel they had to travel to. And it was also on a Sunday that those children between the ages of 7 and 12 might be able to see one of their parents. They never saw them both at the same time, because that would have meant the parents were seeing each other, and men and women were kept apart for obvious reasons. I did actually have to explain that to someone recently, why they'd want to keep women of childbearing age away from their husbands. Yeah, use your imagination. But what they didn't want is any more mouths to feed. So these hours were strict. Now sometimes they actually, there was one workhouse that actually ran out of candles during the winter, so they were allowed to go to bed slightly earlier. But normally this would have been what was adhered to strictly, this routine. And it wasn't just the routine that was adhered to strictly, it was the diet as well. Now this food looks pretty gruesome. You've got bread, gruel for breakfast. You've got alternate days you might have something with meat in it. If not, you'd have suet pudding or soup or bread and cheese. It looks quite unappealing. Again, that was deliberate. Firstly, they had a budget that they had to follow, and they had to keep it within budget. And also, it was meant to be the kind of food you wouldn't want. The other thing to keep in mind is that the Act actually said that the living conditions in the workhouse had to be slightly worse than that of the poorest labourer outside. And unfortunately, this is where it gets a bad rap, because some governors, each workhouse would have a board of governors running it, would take that a bit too literally. And if you had a bad harvest, or it was a really bad winter and there was no food to be had, they would reduce the workers' food further and further down to keep it commensurate with being slightly worse. So if you had people on the outside the walls, who are actually virtually starving, the chances are people inside were slightly worse than virtually starving. This was actually examined quite a few times, and quite a few of these were seen to be scandals. But at the end of the day, these men weren't that educated, a lot of them who were the governors. And they were men, I'm not being sexist there. They were predominantly men for a very, very long time, and a lot of them were just people who were quite well known in the parish, so they didn't necessarily have any welfare experience. They may have been former solicitors, they may have been former shop owners, or even current shop owners, and they were taking the Act to the letter of the law. They weren't interpreting what was just and correct. On average, it was about 1,200 calories a day that the average man got. Not enough. Not enough to keep there for the work they were doing, but just enough to stop them being starving. Now, does anyone actually know what gruel is? When I found this out, my whole thing was, there is no way Oliver Twist would have asked for more. And Oliver Twist and Charles Dickens is another interesting one, because the way he painted the workhouse, some of the things he put in, he took quite a bit of artistic license as to what was actually around in the later 1800s, and he actually took some of the features from the earlier workhouses and the poorhouses that were around beforehand. But gruel, for every pint of hot water, there was 3 tablespoons of oats and a smidge of salt, if you were lucky. Basically hot oaty water. I don't know anyone who would have asked for more, really. Do you? I wouldn't have done. Now, what I was saying about the Victorian attitude towards the poor, they felt it was decreed by God. They didn't feel it was just someone having bad luck or falling on a misfortune or whatever. As far as they were concerned, it was God that decreed who was poor. Think about the hymn, All Things Bright and Beautiful. The poor man at his castle, the rich man at his gate. God made them high and lowly, he ordered their estate. That's how they believed. So therefore, who were they to question what God was decreeing as being the way it should be? They felt social standing wasn't just luck or hard work, it was God. God decided if you were to be high up, or if you were to have money, or if you were to have property, or you to do well in life. And they also believed it was degradation that made these people poor, not that being poor caused the degradation. One of the accounts I read was that people were dirty, poor people were always dirty and dressed in rags. Not that being poor and dressed in rags wasn't what made them poor. It could have been because they were poor, they had to dress in rags and couldn't afford to keep themselves clean. It was chicken and the egg, I suppose. Another thing as well, I'll let you know some of the slang. If you ever read a book that's from the 1800s and they talk about being fed skilly, that's gruel. That's gruel. Same as the workhouse is sometimes known as the spike or the Bastille. Skilly means gruel. But things weren't all bad, in my opinion, in the workhouse. There were things that were done that were, I think, quite ahead of their time. And one of them was schooling. Now, no welfare state is ever going to be perfect. You think about it, we're sort of, nearly 200 years on from the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, and the welfare system still isn't perfect. But what they really were trying to do back then was to stop people claiming it who didn't really need it. Now, whether you think that's right or wrong isn't for me to decide or for us to argue about, but they didn't want people to see it as a hotel that they could check in and out of whenever they needed it. In the 1834 Act, one of the things they actually did introduce, which was, in my view, quite revolutionary, especially as I'm looking into Victorian schooling and the poor schools and ragged schools and all those kind of things, was that each child should have 3 hours of schooling a day. And those 3 hours should include what we would have known as the 3 R's, reading, arithmetic and writing. And also quite a lot of Bible study. Being able to read the Bible and being able to be at one with God was going to be the children. Remember, they wasn't their fault they were poor, and that's how the Victorians genuinely felt. It was going to be their way of getting out of this vicious circle. Now, you may think 3 hours a day, it's a bit trivial. Shouldn't they have had 5 or 6? Well, it wasn't until 1880, so 46 years later, that it became mandatory that all children up to the age of 10 should receive a basic level of education. So that anyone going into the workhouse was actually at a benefit, if you like, to those people outside of it. Not to say that all politicians agreed with it. I found this piece in the Hansard logs. Now, these are to do with things that have been said in the House of Commons hundreds of years ago, and a lot of them, and I won't read it out to you, you can read it for yourself if you want to, but basically a lot of politicians back then would have been the rich. They would have been those who could afford not to have a day job, shall we say, and a lot of them felt that by educating the poor, that would stop the poor being compliant with their station in life, and they might turn around and argue. They might want to do better than themselves. They might have the confidence to ask for more money because they can read and write, and they didn't like this. Now this particular one was to do with when they started trying to get free education, or at least subsidised education, which did start, and you can see, I said 1880 that education for up to 10 years old became mandatory. This was 1807, so you can see how long education for children, free education for children, was being argued. It's a long time. It's a long time. But not all people felt that education was a good thing. The next thing was actually record keeping. Now, as a historian, it's a lot easier when you can find source records of things. And this is where the workhouse, again, believe it or not, stands apart. Now, even though certification of birth, marriage and death became in the July of 1837, it didn't actually become mandatory, i.e. you'd get fined if you didn't do it, until 1875. So between those dates, if you wanted to check up on something, the chances are you would probably have to look at parish records, possibly try and interpret 10 yearly census records. But the workhouse actually did start producing certification from 1837. Actually, some of them just before that, when some of them started opening in 1835 and 1836. They also had very good governor notes, and the governor notes would include who'd come in, who'd come out, punishment records, all those kind of things. So it's a lot easier to find about your relative if you think they may have been in the workhouse in the 19th century. And these records are all available. Some of them have been digitised, not all sadly, but if you go to the local sort of records office for where you think the workhouse was based, you should be able to find them. Stigma. There is still a stigma about being on welfare, let's be honest. People do sort of look down their noses at people who are on welfare, and people who went to the workhouse were no different. There was a huge stigma attached to the workhouse. The wall, going behind the wall, going to the... some people used to equate it to prison, which it wasn't. You could leave at any time. I sometimes wonder if this stigma was intentional, almost a bit like propaganda, to, dissuade as many people as possible from relying on the workhouse to look after them. But what they did realise is, even though they made the workhouse dress, as it was known, it wasn't called a uniform, it was called the workhouse dress, as unappealing as possible, as raggedy as possible, as ill-fitting as possible. The fact you would share dorms, sometimes 2 or 3 to a bed if it was a busy workhouse, the relentless work, the never-ending hours, the boring and unappetising food, I think that was done deliberately. It was done deliberately to dissuade people from coming. But what about those children who were born in the workhouse? And a lot of children were born in the workhouse. What about them? They would have been stigmatised for the rest of their lives because their place of birth would be down as the workhouse. Well, in 1904, they created basic workhouse addresses to go in instead of the, say, Chelmsford Workhouse. And using Chelmsford as an example, if you have a relative you think possibly could have been born in the workhouse, or for some reason you can't find their address and it's listed as 48 Wood Street, that's Chelmsford Workhouse, St John's as we affectionately know it round here. Now, just because they were born at St John's doesn't necessarily mean they were born in the workhouse, because St John's did become a hospital in the sort of mid-1930s, as did a lot of workhouses. A lot of workhouses, I can normally spot them. They're now hospitals, and there is a reason for that. Again, that's a whole new presentation if you're really interested. But if you find someone and you think that address doesn't exist, just have a look and see if it's possibly what was used for the workhouse, if it's after 1904. And when you're looking for relatives, it might give you some answers. But don't be upset if they were born in the workhouse. It doesn't necessarily mean you don't have to attach the same stigma now that would have been attached then, because for a lot of people who had very little money, the workhouse was the only place to go to get any kind of medical intervention whatsoever. And even though it wasn't until the later 1800s that they did actually start paying nurses, before then the nurses were basically volunteer paupers, and there would have been a medical officer of varying capabilities, it was still the only place to get any medical attention whatsoever. Well, that's pretty much my presentation done and dusted for you. I said I'd keep it short and sweet. If you're interested in learning more about the workhouses, let me know. I'm sure I can put some more together for you if that's something you'd like to know, like about the medical side or about the schooling, any of those kind of subjects. But there are 3 workhouse museums in the UK, in England, that you can go and visit. One's called Gresson Hall, and that's in Norfolk in East Anglia. And there's another one called Southwell or Southwell, and that's near Nottingham in sort of, I suppose, what would you call it, the East Midlands. That's the NHS National Trust even property that I mentioned. And then you've got the beautiful Ripon Workhouse that's up north, up in North Yorkshire. I know at least 2 of those you can do investigations at as well if the paranormal is more your bag. Ripon, it would be through a group called Simply Ghost Nights, and Gresson will just keep an eye out for who's investigating there, because I know Simply Ghost Nights go there, but I also know quite a few other groups do as well. If the history is your bag, there's not that many workhouse historians. But there's a very good website that's put together by a brilliant writer called Peter Higginbotham. He has written so many books on the workhouse. They're absolutely fascinating. I've actually got a lot of them myself. They're invaluable, and his website is absolutely invaluable as well. Well, that's me. I hope you've enjoyed our whistle-stop tour of the workhouses. If you have got any questions, like I said, please feel free to ping them down below, or drop me a message, and I'll speak to you all again soon. Take care. Bye.